There is a way that I think we can use the mechanics that are in the game to make Salvage engaging and tactile gameplay without it becoming a clone of mining. Hey everybody, I'm Ryan, aka CitizenRyan, and welcome to my channel. I want to talk about structural salvage. So Star Citizen in 3.22 has finally brought to us the first implementation of structural salvage. Now this was met with a lot of praise from people really excited that this feature is finally in, including myself, but also a lot of criticism about the simplicity of the implementation. And I kind of agree with both of these. So when we look at the current implementation of salvage, what are some of the problems that we see? Number one, salvage should encourage teamwork, and right now on the Reclaimer, the claw plays no part in the hull scraping, and the beam operators play no meaningful role in the fracturing or disintegration piece. Secondly, with the current implementation of the fracture and disintegration features, there's no tactile feeling involved. It's a bit anticlimactic too. When the disintegration mode is activated, basically these ships are Thanos'd out of midair and the little particles go flying through space across quite large distances right into the claw of the ship. Now just to get this out of the way, there's a lot of people who think that this physical claw that has been replaced is going to come back in the future with Maelstrom. I don't see it that way. Looking at the dev responses and the videos, I interpret that as something they wish they could have done, but they're going to go down this road instead. So to you guys who think it's going to come back, I hope you're right. But for the purposes of this video, that's not going to be a part of the equation. When I see the salvage loop, I know that they're going to iterate upon it and make it better. My concern right now is that the trajectory is it will be another mining loop where you have to keep a parameter in the green in order to fracture and disintegrate a ship. So in my head, I have a solution that I want to get out there into the world about how within the limitations of the engine and what they can do today, we can make a loop that's engaging, encourages teamwork, feels really tactile, and is just a different loop from mining. So I'm gonna walk through each of the steps of that and you're gonna have questions about it. So we're gonna go through a second time and I'll explain every change that I made to the loop and talk about how I think that could happen in the verse. I'm not a game dev, my degree is from watching around the verse, but still I think it's an interesting idea. So if you're down for that, let's go ahead and get started. So let's start with what makes salvage salvage inside of Star Citizen. Well, for one, it's not just another game loop where you sit in a chair and you keep a parameter in the green so something doesn't explode in your face. Instead, it's much more of a relaxing gameplay loop, kind of like a power washing simulator, where it's all about efficiency and diminishing returns, and how you choose to work is going to affect what your profit is going to be. It's also very tactile, so even though you may not be physically touching something else, you're having a direct feeling like you are working on something. Hull scraping, which is the first phase of salvaging, really is a good example of this, where although your character is not physically in contact with the target ship, they're controlling the salvage beam exactly where it goes and ripping the hull off of it. So it accomplishes both of these things at once. These are two things that we want to make sure we keep inside of the salvage loop as it's getting developed. Now, some of this you're going to have to use your imagination because not all of these mechanics exist, and I did my best to use in-game assets to demonstrate them. A crew on board a Reclaimer take a salvage mission and travel there together. The pilot takes the Reclaimer and faces the target ship. The claw operator activates the claw, extending it to just a few feet away from the target ship. The claw operator then activates a short-range, very powerful gravity field, locking the target ship in its grasp. The two beam operators then use their choice of salvage beam to begin stripping the hull from the target ship. To allow the beam operators to continue to scrape at full efficiency, they communicate with the claw operator, who's able to use the gravity field, not the claw itself, to rotate, slide, and to a very limited extent push and pull the target ship, exposing the best angles to the beam operators. Once the crew is satisfied with their scraping, they get ready to fracture the target ship. The claw switches to fracture mode. The claw operator maneuvers the target ship to expose the game's predetermined fracture seams to the beam operators. The beam turrets switch into a new cutting mode. In this mode, the turrets exert a huge amount of force onto one single point, which causes any hull it comes in contact with to be pushed away, unless that hull is clamped by the gravity field of the claw. The beam operators begin to trace the fracture seams with their cutting lasers, causing them to weaken. When the team is ready, the claw operator activates the fracture gravity pulse on the target ship, splitting it along the weakened seams into the game's predefined segments. The crew now gets ready to compact the fragmented segments. The beam operators switch to their tractor beams, and the claw operators switch to compacting mode. When a beam operator uses the tractor beam to draw a segment into the range of the claw's gravity field, the claw operator can then click on that segment, starting compaction. The claw charges and then releases a compacting force on that segment in its range. As the fragmented segment is compacted, it is converted into a number of scrap entities, the size and shape of SCU containers depending on how much material was in that segment. Once the segments have been compacted, or when the crew is ready, they enter munching mode. The beam operators get their tractor beams, and the claw operator enters munch mode. When a scrap entity is tractored into the gravity field of the claw operator then clicks on that scrap and an animation takes over, funneling the scrap rectangle into the grinder located on the claw. As the scrap transits into the claw, it's converted by the reclaimer into the construction material commodity. This is repeated until all of the scrap entities are gone or until the ship's buffer is full and needs to be emptied. This approach to salvage scratches the itch for tactile and teamwork-based gameplay while staying within the limits of the engine. Okay, so I'm sure there's a lot of questions and possibly comments that are going to come from this saying, hey, CIG is not going to do a bunch of rework, and I completely agree with you. For the same reason I think the physical claw is gone and won't come back on Maelstrom, I don't think they're going to be going back and doing a bunch of changes, making new stuff for this loop. So I want to go back and address the changes that are in there and how I think they could be done with existing technology. Again, I'm not a game dev, so I could be very wrong, and if you see something that's blocking it, go ahead and put that in the comments. I want to learn, and maybe somebody knows something I don't know and that you don't know too. So let's have a discussion about that. So let's walk back through. So the first thing in this loop that's different is that the claw operator gets a gravity field. Now there's two reasons for this. Number one, this gravity field is really just a reuse of the existing tractor beam. However, it would be a bespoke tractor beam that has an extremely limited range and is very strong. Very similar to how the Vulture operates right now, just making the Reclaimer a 3-person team instead of the 2-person beam operated crew. Secondly, why gravity I think makes a lot of sense is the Reclaimer has a giant glowing spinning gravity ball exposed as like a main feature on the interior. So leaning into gravity not only makes sense for the ship, but also for the capabilities of a claw and holding something tightly, splitting objects by slamming it with a gravity pulse wave, compacting them down into scrap, and finally holding and drawing that scrap into the grinder located on the front of the claw. So the second major change to this loop is the addition of the cutting beam. Now, I don't know the amount of work that it would really take to go into this, but I imagine that a couple things would have to happen. Number one, we would have to mark up the target ships with the seams that could receive the weakened flag after a cutting beam's gone across, and also the beam itself would have to be made. There's some good news in that a cutting beam animation already exists on the multi-tool, so if that was able to be added to the turret, I think you have the makings of what is essentially going to be a weakening beam for the turret. In order to make the claw really useful in the fracturing mode, this cutting beam I imagine would have an extremely strong pushing force. So that way it only wants to hit items that are locked into the claw. If you hit something else, it would go spinning away. And that really makes the claw important. But also you could put a radius around this cutting beam that would destroy any unscraped hull, which really leans into the whole efficiency versus diminishing returns and how the crew chooses to operate without like a huge penalty, but just needing to weigh those pros and cons. So we don't know what Maelstrom's going to look like, but it does seem like this cutting beam, which is a large force being applied to a single point, would play really nicely with it in the future, because Maelstrom is all about two forces being applied to a joint to see if that joint's going to crack or not. So theoretically, if you ran this beam across a ship, you could either weaken the joints there to then be broken by that pulse wave, or they could just slice right through the ship because of the large force being applied. So I don't know, but it seems like it could expand pretty well with that. And lastly, this needs to have UI associated with it. That would probably take some work to do. The last piece of this fracture seam element I didn't touch on in the first loop, but it's something that would help address the possibility of griefing with the fracture mechanic. Right now, CIG has it where if the power plant is on, you cannot fracture, so it has to be off. The problem is those can be turned off pretty easily with distortion weapons. So what I suggest with this loop is that you can fracture a ship without cutting the seams first, but it would require a lot more energy, which would cause any power plant that's installed in a ship to explode. This explosion would be very clearly marked on the UI like, hey, if you do this, it will explode. It's not like mining where you messed up and it exploded. but you clearly made the decision to do this. Now, if you did, it would not destroy the reclaimer and wipe out everything you have, but it would at least take out the claw in the arm there. So now if I'm a griefer, I have to weigh that decision of, hey, do I want to lose my claw? Am I really into this? Is it worth that to me? Or do I need to now spend the time to weaken the seams first before I actually go through with my griefing? So it makes it take more time, and I think it's one extra step that could be implemented to prevent the griefing in the first place. Not to mention, this adds one more decision element for the salvage crew. Do they want to send a team over into the subject ship and remove all the components before they get into the fracture mode? Or do they want to weaken the seams and get on with structural salvage? So something I love about this loop is it takes the disintegration piece and it kind of converts that into two separate phases. One where the segment is converted into piles of scrap, and a second where those piles of scrap are taken into the reclaimer and converted into construction materials. So this solves a couple different problems. One, right now, when you dissolve an 890 jump that's huge, you don't have enough room in your buffer for it, so a lot of that material is just lost. Plus, the remote disintegration doesn't carry that same tactile feeling as compacting something. The problem with compacting is it's really similar to what we saw in the ISC from a few weeks ago, where you have this giant piece trying to be converted into a bunch of little entities and it took way too long. I think this solves that problem because all that material can be logically condensed down by this gravity field into shapeable, fewer number of entities. You could even say if there was too much material or too many entities being spawned, that you could then have an upgrade path where your claw could be upgraded with a stronger compactor, and that could put more SU material into the same size. But it allows multiple reclaimers to work together because you can compact that one into all the entities and then start munching those away. You can even snap those entities to a grid if you wanted to and fly them away and sell them like regular scrap if you wanted to. Now, the munching part, it's not physical munching, okay? It is not Maelstrom. It is actually just an animation. So what would happen is when that piece got drawn up to right where that claw is, as soon as you click, the animation takes over. That rectangle goes right to the middle, starts being drawn in and crunched away by the grinder. But what's really happening is that entity is just despawned and this animation plays out, and it's done just like it is right now in the disintegration mode, except it can look a little more logical. That's pretty much it. Again, do I think CIG is going to do this? No. Am I a game designer? Absolutely not. But I just have this loop in my head and I love the idea, so I want to put it out there. I want to see your comments. You can prove me wrong and tell me why it's not going to work, or you can agree with me. I'm curious to see what you guys think. And if this is not possible or you don't like this idea, I would love to know what your idea is. And for the sake of conversation, throw the engine out the window. I want to know what you would want to see in Salvage. So whether or not you agreed with me on Salvage, I want to thank you for watching to the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, feel free to leave a like and subscribe for more. It took a long time to make and would not have been possible without the incredible community of Star Citizen and on this channel, especially Denny, who literally put in hours to get the reclaimers you saw on screen. If you want to join us in the verse and work on future videos, the link to my Discord is in the description below. Until next time, I'll see you in the verse.